Andre Washington was 38 years old, and until that Saturday night, his wife Brittany believed she had married a quiet, unremarkable IT contractor who drove a 5-year-old Camry and had no idea what she was doing behind his back. She was wrong about all of it. For 3 years, Andre had watched, waited, and said nothing, while Brittany met another man in restaurants she never mentioned, consulted a divorce attorney she thought he didn't know about, and pre-packed a garbage bag of his clothes in the hallway closet, waiting for the right moment to throw him out of what she was certain was her house. That moment came at 2 in the morning. She put her hands on him. She threw the bag at his chest on the front porch and told him not to come back. She stood in the doorway, watching him walk down that dark driveway, and she felt something she had never once felt in 3 years of lying to his face. She felt like she had won. She had no idea that the man she just threw out had already made one phone call. And she had exactly 3 minutes before 12 black SUVs rolled in from both ends of her street, engines quiet, headlights cutting through the dark, and sealed off her driveway so completely that there was nowhere left to run. She thought she beat him. She had no idea what she had just started. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The spreadsheets were not complicated. Andre Washington sat at the kitchen counter with his laptop open, a half-finished cup of coffee beside him, and a column of billing figures on the screen that he had reviewed twice already without really seeing them. Not because the numbers were wrong, because the numbers were never wrong. His operations director sent clean reports, always had. And Andre's job at this particular hour of a Thursday evening was simply to confirm what he already knew. He confirmed it. He moved to the next row. Behind him, heels clicked against hardwood, then stopped. Then the bathroom door opened and closed. He did not turn around. Brittany came through the kitchen 4 minutes later. Andre registered her the way he registered most things, quietly, completely, without announcing that he was doing it. She was dressed in the kind of outfit that required consideration, not a dinner with April outfit. April was her friend from the gym. They ate at the kind of places where you could show up in whatever you had on. This was something else. The dress was deep burgundy. Her earrings caught the light above the island. She checked her phone, then checked it again. 30 seconds later. The way you check something you are waiting on rather than something you are browsing. Smells good, Andre said. I'm going to dinner with April. She did not look up from the phone. Don't wait up. Tell her I said hey. Brittany was already moving toward the garage door. She pulled it open, stepped through, and it swung shut behind her with the soft mechanical click of a house that was well built and properly maintained. Andre listened to her car back out of the driveway. Then he looked back at the spreadsheet. He was the founding partner of Washington Capital Group. That sentence lived in the background of everything and announced itself to no one, which was precisely the way Andre had always wanted it. The firm had 11 full-time employees, 3 active federal infrastructure contracts, and a technology investment portfolio that his accountant had valued, conservatively, at $39 million at the end of last quarter. Conservative was the key word. His accountant was a careful man. So was Andre. He drove a clean but unremarkable SUV, a 4-year-old model in dark gray, nothing anyone looked at twice. He bought groceries at the same store he had shopped at in his 20s, when he was eating rice and building spreadsheets in a studio apartment, and telling himself the work would compound if he let it. He wore clothes that fit well and cost less than people assumed. He owned the house they lived in through a holding company, Washington Capital Holdings, LLC, established 6 years before he ever met Brittany Washington, née Cole. His father, Franklin, had taught him this, or tried to, before Franklin died when Andre was 11 and left him the lesson without the man to reinforce it. Let people see what they expect to see, Franklin used to say, in the particular quiet voice of someone passing something important across a table. Save the rest for people who've earned it. Dorothy, his mother, had reinforced it through 30 years of simply living it. She had cleaned offices on night shifts for over a decade after Franklin passed, raising Andre on discipline and clarity and the understanding that the quality of your character was the one thing no one could repossess. Andre had built Washington Capital Group on that understanding. Slowly, deliberately, over 15 years of patient, compounding choices. Brittany had never asked what he actually earned. She believed he managed mid-level IT contracts for federal agencies, which was technically a fraction of the truth, stretched thin enough to cover the whole of it. She had never asked to see a pay stub, never questioned the house, never wondered why, occasionally, men in well-fitted suits called him on a separate phone and addressed him with the particular deference reserved for people who sign things. She had never been curious about the details of his life in the way a person is curious about someone they love. Andre had noticed this a long time ago. He had filed it away. He stood from the counter to refill his coffee, and he noticed, without planning to, that Brittany's mug was still on the counter where she'd left it. He carried it to the sink, rinsed it, reached to set it in the dish rack, and his eyes moved, the way eyes do when they are trained to move, to the cabinet above the sink. The door sat slightly unlatched. Andre opened it. The note was small, torn from a notepad, the kind with the soft yellow paper. It was taped to the inside of the cabinet door at eye level, positioned so that it would be readable in a quick glance without requiring the cabinet to be fully open. An address, a time, a date, tomorrow's date, and one name, written in handwriting Andre did not recognize, in capital letters with a period after it, like it was the only word that needed to be on the page. Garrison. Andre looked at it for a long moment. He did not move. He did not feel his pulse change. He simply looked at the note the way he looked at everything, fully, without rushing, understanding it completely before he did anything at all. He took out his phone, photographed the note. Then he pressed the tape back down at the corner where it had begun to lift, closed the cabinet door until it latched, and walked down the hall to his home office. He sat down. He looked at the wall for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and called Jerome Banks. Jerome answered on the second ring. "Tomorrow I need you available all day," Andre said. "Call Harold tonight. Tell him I need 30 minutes before 9. He hung up. He went back to his spreadsheets. He finished them. He washed his coffee cup, turned off the kitchen light, and went to bed. He slept the way he always slept, fully, without interruption, without the low hum of unresolved panic that keeps lesser men staring at ceilings in the dark. Panic was a luxury. Clarity was a weapon. Andre Washington had never confused the two. The restaurant was not what he expected. Andre had imagined something louder, one of the new rooftop places downtown with the dim lighting and the overpriced cocktail menus. This was quieter, a mid-range Italian spot on a street with metered parking and a valet stand that existed mainly to make the place feel more expensive than it was. The kind of restaurant designed to impress someone who didn't eat at truly expensive restaurants very often. He had been parked across the street since noon. The rental was a 4-door sedan in silver, unremarkable in the way Jerome always arranged things, the color and make of a car that disappears into any parking lot in any city in America. Andre was in the passenger seat with the angle adjusted, a plain dark jacket, a baseball cap pulled low, a coffee from the drive-thru 2 blocks over, sitting in the cup holder. He was not hiding. He was simply not being looked for. Brittany arrived at 12:17 p.m. She parked herself, valet was apparently not required when you arrived first, and walked to the entrance in heels she had no business wearing to a lunch on a Friday. She looked good. Andre acknowledged this the way he acknowledged most difficult truths, directly, without sentiment. And then he moved on. He watched the door. Garrison Price arrived at 12:21 p.m. He handed his keys to the valet with the easy motion of a man who had done it so many times it had stopped meaning anything. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, dressed in a blazer that fit well over a collared shirt with the top button open. His shoes were the kind that got noticed. He paused outside the entrance for just a moment, long enough to straighten his jacket, long enough to be seen doing it, and then he pushed through the door. Andre had his phone up before the man's hand left the handle. He took 4 photographs in 8 seconds. Garrison's face, clear and unobstructed in the early afternoon light. His car, a recent model, something European, dark blue. The valet ticket exchange, the entrance. He pulled up Jerome's number and sent all 4 with a text below them. I need everything. Today. Then he set the phone in his lap and finished his coffee, and looked at the restaurant door for another 60 seconds without moving. He had seen what he came to see. He did not need to go inside. He did not need to watch them eat, or count how many times she touched his arm, or confirm anything beyond what the note had already told him, and what his own eyes had just added to the picture. He had what he needed for now. What he needed next was information. He started the car and pulled out of the lot. He made the first call before he reached the end of the block. Harold Sims picked up on the 3rd ring, which meant he was between something and not in a meeting. Harold was always between something. It's Andre. I know, Harold said. Jerome called me last night. I need you to hear something first before we move. I'm listening. Andre told him what he knew. The note, the restaurant, the name. He told him without editorializing, without the language of injury, the way you brief someone whose job is to understand facts rather than feelings. Harold listened without interrupting once. This was one of the things Andre valued most about him. When Andre finished, Harold was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Tell me when, he said. Soon, Andre said. Not yet. He ended the call and dialed his operations director. A brief and administrative conversation about a contract deliverable that needed rescheduling. The kind of call that kept the machinery of the firm running regardless of what was happening in the rest of his life. He did not discuss the rest of his life. He discussed the deliverable, confirmed the timeline, and hung up. The 3rd call was to Jerome to confirm he had received the photographs. Jerome said he had. He said nothing else. Andre said nothing else. The call lasted under 30 seconds. The 4th call was the most deliberate one. Agent Douglas Webb worked in the downtown Federal Building, a policy office whose precise function Andre had never asked about, and Webb had never volunteered. They had met 3 years ago at an infrastructure policy conference where Webb had been a panelist and Andre had been in the 3rd row asking the kind of specific, structural questions that make government employees notice you. They had stayed in occasional contact since, the careful, unhurried contact of 2 people who recognize that a relationship has potential value without forcing it into shape before it's ready. Webb picked up after 2 rings. Andre Washington, he said. It wasn't a greeting so much as a confirmation. I have a name I want to run by you, Andre said. Casually. Not officially. I'm not asking for anything you can't give. Go ahead. Garrison Price, regional real estate developer, based here. The pause on the other end lasted 4 seconds. Not long, but long enough. That name, Webb said slowly, exists in a context I'm not the right person to speak to. Understood. It would be appropriate for your attorney to reach out to a colleague of mine. Her name is Patricia Okafor. He spelled the last name without being asked, at his earliest convenience. Thank you, Andre said. I didn't tell you anything, Webb said. I know, Andre said. He ended the call and drove back to the office. He worked the rest of the afternoon the same way he worked every afternoon. Steadily, without distraction, moving through his task list with the unhurried focus of a man whose capacity to compartmentalize had been built over decades of genuine necessity. Jerome's report arrived at 8:46 p.m. 12 pages. No editorializing. Jerome never editorialized. Garrison Price, 42. Regional real estate developer with a portfolio built on over-leveraged acquisitions and short-term debt, rolled over so many times the paper trail looked less like a business strategy and more like a man perpetually running to stay ahead of the last thing he bought. 2 dissolved business partnerships in the past 6 years, both ending quietly enough to avoid litigation, but loudly enough to survive in the memory of people who paid attention to these things. A professional reputation that was strong in the rooms where he had performed well, and thin in the rooms where the performance had run out. The man had charm. Andre could see that from the parking lot. Charm was not nothing. But charm was not a balance sheet. He read it all the way through. Then he read it again. Attached at the back, 4 pages, was what Jerome had pulled on Brittany. She had consulted a family law attorney 3 times in the past 2 months. A firm on the East Side with a reputation for high-asset divorce proceedings. She had not filed anything. She was building toward something, quietly and carefully, in the same way that people who have decided on an outcome begin preparing for it before they announce it. Andre set his phone face down on the desk. He sat with it for a moment. Then he picked the phone back up and typed 2 words to Jerome. Watch her. The argument started over dinner. Not a real dinner. Brittany hadn't cooked, and Andre hadn't expected her to. He'd put something together himself, simple food, and they'd eaten mostly in silence the way they'd been eating for weeks. It was Saturday. She'd come home that afternoon from wherever she'd been and changed clothes and seemed fine, or performing fine, which had started to look the same. Andre set down his fork. How was last night? He asked. Good. She reached for her glass. April picked that new place downtown. We stayed later than I meant to. Which place? The new one. A small gesture with her hand. Vague. Comfortable with the vagueness. On 5th. You know the one. What's it called? A half-second. Small. Most people wouldn't catch it. Brittany caught it herself. He could see her catch it. The slight adjustment behind her eyes, the recalibration. A woman shifting her weight without moving. I don't remember the exact name. It was April's idea. Andre nodded. He picked his fork back up. He said nothing else. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. Brittany felt the difference. He watched her feel it. The way she set her glass down a little too carefully, the way her jaw shifted. She couldn't locate what had changed. She only knew something had. That was enough to light the fuse. She went from uneasy to aggressive in the way she always did. Not gradually, but in a single pivot, like a door swinging on a hinge. One moment she was managing the conversation, and the next she was done managing it. And when Brittany was done managing something, she moved straight through it. She said he was always doing this, watching her, timing her, acting like she owed him a report every time she walked out the door. Andre said he'd asked a simple question. She said the way he asked it wasn't simple. Said he asked it like an accusation, like he'd already decided something and was just waiting for her to confirm it. He didn't raise his voice. He asked her what she thought he had decided. That was when her eyes went cold. She stood up from the table. Her voice climbed. Words came fast and sharp. The kind of words designed not to communicate, but to overwhelm, to make the other person retreat just far enough that she could reset the terms. He had been cold for weeks. He was never present. She was tired of feeling like a guest in her own house. Her own house. She said it like that. Andre stayed seated. His hands were flat on the table where she could see them. His phone was on the counter 6 feet behind him, face down and still, and it had been recording for 13 minutes by the time she stood up. He had placed it there before he asked the first question. He had known this was the night. Not the exact shape of it, but the fact of it. that the thing building between them had reached the edge of what could be held back, and that Brittany, when pushed, always moved forward. He hadn't known how far forward. The mug came without much warning. She grabbed it off the counter in one motion, his coffee mug, ceramic, dark blue, and threw it with real force. It caught his shoulder, the thick part above the joint, and clattered hard against the cabinet behind him. He didn't flinch. He didn't reach for his shoulder. He looked at her. "Brittany!" She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and shoved him with both hands, hard enough that his back hit the counter edge and the breath went out of him for a moment. She was stronger than most people expected. She always had been. Andre put both hands up at his sides, palms out, and kept them there. His voice stayed level. "You need to step back." She didn't step back. She pointed at him and told him she was done. That she was done with all of it, done with him, done with the quiet and the watching and the nothing of the life they had built together. She said it with the confidence of someone who has rehearsed the feeling, if not the exact words. Then she left the kitchen. He heard her in the hallway. Then the closet. A dragging sound, heavy, fabric against floor, that he recognized for what it was before she came back around the corner. A black garbage bag, his clothes, folded, not thrown. She had packed it carefully. Not today, not in the last hour in some burst of anger. She had packed it days ago and placed it in the closet, and waited for the right moment to drag it out. Andre looked at the bag, then at her face. She walked past him and opened the front door and threw the bag onto the porch. It landed hard. She turned back to him. "Get out," she said. "And if you come back, I'll call the police and tell them you put your hands on me. I've got a bruise from last week that'll say whatever I need it to say." She was breathing fast. Her eyes were bright with the particular energy of someone who believes they have just won. Andre walked to the front door. He picked up the bag where it had landed on the porch. He held it at his side and turned to look at her. She was standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, backlit by the kitchen light, her expression already assembling itself into something like triumph. He looked at her for a long moment. "You should stay by the door," he said. She almost smiled. She heard a broken man guessing at consequences. Andre turned and walked down the driveway. His phone was at his ear before he reached the end of the pavement. The call lasted under a minute. He confirmed the address. He said it was time. He said to bring the documentation package. Then he said one word. "Both." He ended the call. He stood at the bottom of his driveway in the dark, holding a garbage bag of his own clothes, and he waited. He didn't wait long. The first SUV came from the far end of the block at 2:12 a.m. Black, no markings, moving at the deliberate pace of something that has never needed to hurry. A second appeared from the same direction. Then headlights from the opposite end of the street, and more from the cross block. And within 90 seconds, there were 12 of them arranged across both lanes with the precision of a thing that had been practiced. 6 carried government plates. The other 6 carried a small, discreet logo on their front doors, white on black. A name, clean and understated. Washington Capital Group. Brittany was still standing in the doorway. Jerome Banks stepped out of the lead Washington Capital vehicle and walked directly to Andre at the end of the driveway. He was carrying a garment bag. He held it out without a word. Andre took it, unzipped it, and removed a jacket. Dark, well cut. The jacket of a man who has somewhere to be. He put it on. He buttoned it without hurrying. From the government vehicles, Agent Patricia Okafor approached the front porch with 2 uniformed officers at her flanks. She moved the way she always moved, without theater, without aggression, with the calm of someone whose paperwork was already signed and who had nowhere better to be than exactly here. Brittany watched her come up the porch steps. Her hand was still on the doorframe. Okafor held up her credentials. She said, "Mrs. Washington, I need you to step inside, please." We have a number of things to discuss." The officer to her left began speaking. His voice was even, practiced, and clear. "You have the right to remain silent. Not for the affair. Not for any divorce strategy. For criminal assault and battery. Recorded in full. Audio only. On a phone placed on a kitchen counter 13 minutes before. The first word of the argument was ever spoken." Brittany's mouth opened. The words did not come. She looked past Okafor and past the officers. She looked at the SUVs on her street. She found the logo on the door of the nearest Washington Capitol vehicle, and she read it, and she read it again. And then she looked for Andre. He was at the end of the driveway, standing straight, jacket on, Jerome to his right. He was not looking at her. He had already looked away. The lead Washington Capitol SUV eased away from the curb, slow and unhurried, and the 5 behind it followed in sequence, pulling out one by one into the dark street. Brittany watched from the doorway, between the officers in the light, as the man she threw a garbage bag at 40 minutes ago moved away from her house in a motorcade she had never known belonged to him. She had thought she beat him. She had thought she won. She was standing in her own doorway in handcuffs, and the quiet man she had spent 3 years not being curious about had just shown her, in the space of 3 minutes, that she had never known him at all. The drive from home to Dorothy's house in Akron is 4 hours and 11 minutes. Andre made it in 3 hours and 50, not because he was rushing, but because the roads were empty, and the dark outside the windows was the right kind of quiet. The kind that does not ask anything of you, that simply holds you while you move through it. He pulled into Dorothy's driveway at 5:47 a.m. The kitchen light was already on. She did not ask how he got there or why he had come. She opened the door, looked at his face for 1 full second, and turned back toward the stove. By the time he sat down at the kitchen table, she had eggs cracking in the pan. The kitchen smelled like coffee and dish soap and the particular warmth of a house where someone has been awake for hours. Dorothy moved quietly between the stove and the counter, unhurried, not filling the silence with anything. She poured him a cup and set it in front of him without ceremony. She sat down across from him only when the plate was ready, and she folded her hands around her own cup, and she waited. That was Dorothy's gift. She always knew when to be quiet. Andre told her everything. He started with the note, the handwriting, the cabinet, the date, Garrison's name. He told her about the rental car and the restaurant and Jerome's report, and the 8 months and the 3 visits to the family law attorney. He told her about the Saturday night, about the argument, about the mug hitting his shoulder and the shove and the garbage bag she had already packed, already waiting in the closet for the right moment. He told her about the porch and the handcuffs and the SUVs and the jacket and the logo she couldn't read until it was already pulling away from the curb. Dorothy listened to all of it. She did not interrupt once. Her hands stayed folded around her cup, and her eyes stayed on his face, and the kitchen was very quiet. When he finished, she was still for a long moment. Then she said, "She looked at you every day, and never once tried to see you. That's not your failure, baby. That's hers." Andre nodded. He picked up his fork. He ate his breakfast. Across the city, in a conference room on the 3rd floor of the Federal Building downtown, Agent Patricia Okafor set a manila folder on the table and did not open it yet. She had been doing this long enough to know that timing mattered. Not theatrical timing. She had no interest in theater. Practical timing. The sequence in which information lands determines what a person does with it. And Okafor was very deliberate about sequence. Across the table, Brittany Washington sat with her hands flat in her lap. Beside her was Marcus Lloyd, a civil attorney who had been arranged by phone before 7 a.m. by someone Brittany had called the moment the officers gave her back her phone. Lloyd was competent, well-dressed, and operating under the impression based entirely on what Brittany had told him, that this was a domestic matter with some procedural complications. He had a yellow legal pad and a pen, and the composed expression of a man who expected to be in and out of this room in under an hour. Okafor introduced herself. She thanked them for coming. She said that before they discussed the events of Saturday evening, she wanted to share some context that she believed would be useful for everyone in the room. Then she opened the folder. She told them that the IRS Criminal Investigation Division had maintained an active financial fraud case against Garrison Price for 18 months, that the investigation had been building from the outside in, tracing income concealment across a network of shell companies registered in 3 different states, following a pattern of transactions recorded as consulting fees from entities that had no real operational footprint. She said this in the even, unhurried way of someone reading from a fact sheet they have memorized, which she had. Then she said that 6 weeks ago, an attorney named Harold Sims contacted her office and provided documentation. She laid 3 pages on the table. Wire transfer, 3 of them, spanning 7 months, between a business account registered in the name of Brittany Ann Washington and the primary operating account of Garrison Price's largest LLC. On Garrison's end, each transfer had been recorded as a consulting payment from a company that did not, in any meaningful functional sense, exist. Okafor did not editorialize. She simply let the pages sit. Lloyd leaned forward. He picked up the first page. He read it. He set it down and picked up the second. His pen had stopped moving after the first 30 seconds and had not moved since. Brittany stared at the transfers. Her own name on the account line? Her own account? 3 times. She had believed she was helping Garrison manage legitimate business expenses. He had told her it was temporary, that it was a structuring issue with one of his LLCs, that he would explain the details when things were less complicated. She had not asked many questions. She had trusted him. She understood, sitting in that room under the fluorescent light, that her trust had been its own kind of answer. Marcus Lloyd set down the 3rd page and asked for a recess. Brittany stood in the hallway outside the conference room and called Garrison's number. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. She called again. 4 rings. Voicemail. She stood with her back against the wall and called a 3rd time. The line rang once, twice, and then nothing. Not voicemail, just silence, and then a click, and then the empty sound of a call that had been declined. She lowered the phone. The hallway was long and fluorescent and completely indifferent to her. A man in a suit walked past without looking up. A door closed somewhere at the far end. The building went about its business around her, as if she were not there at all. She stood holding her phone, and she understood, for the first time, that there was no one on the other end of any of this. She was completely alone in it. The conference room on the 11th floor of the Meridian Tower had the particular feel of a room designed to communicate seriousness without warmth. Dark wood table, leather chairs, a credenza along one wall with a water pitcher nobody ever touched. The blinds were angled to let in light without letting in the street. Denise Fuller arrived first. She set her leather portfolio on the table, uncapped her pen, and reviewed her notes from the weekend. She had accepted Brittany Washington's case on Saturday afternoon, after a 40-minute phone consultation that painted a clear enough picture. High-asset marriage, husband with a private firm, no children, a wife who wanted out and wanted it clean. Denise had handled dozens of cases like it. She knew the terrain. Harold Sims arrived at 9 on the dot. He set his briefcase on the chair beside him, shook Denise's hand with the brief, firm grip of a man who does not use pleasantries to fill time, and sat down. He did not open the briefcase immediately. He looked at Denise across the table and said calmly that he appreciated her time, and that he wanted to be straightforward with her, because he believed that was the most efficient use of both their mornings. Denise said she appreciated that. She had her pen ready. Harold opened the briefcase. The first document landed on the table with a quiet, flat sound. It was the deed to the house on Callaway Drive. The house Brittany had thrown a garbage bag out of 11 days ago. The house she had been calling hers for 3 years with the unthinking confidence of someone who has never had reason to check. Harold did not present it with any ceremony. He simply placed it in front of Denise and gave her a moment to read the top section. The property was held by Washington Capital Holdings, LLC. The registration date was printed clearly on the second line. 6 years and 4 months before Andre and Brittany Washington's wedding. Attached behind the deed was a full chain of title, clean, unambiguous, with corporate filings that predated the marriage by enough time to make the legal question not a question at all. The house was a corporate asset. It had been a corporate asset before Brittany Washington existed in Andre Washington's life. It would remain a corporate asset after she left it. Denise read the document. She read the registration date twice. She set it down. Her pen did not move. Harold placed the second document on the table. This one was thicker. A founding partnership agreement for Washington Capital Group, executed 8 years before the marriage, signed and notarized and accompanied by a valuation summary that an accountant had attached to the back. A conservative figure, clearly sourced, clearly dated. Denise's eyes moved to the number. She was a family law attorney. She had sat across from wealthy husbands before. She knew what a real estate portfolio looked like on paper, what a business owner's disclosed income looked like, what the structure of a man trying to protect assets in anticipation of divorce looked. This did not look like any of those things. What it looked like was a man who had built something real over a very long time and had never hidden it from anyone, had simply never been asked about it. The equity stake, the ownership protections, the predating documentation, all of it was not a scramble to shelter assets. It was the natural architecture of a business that had existed, quietly and substantially, for the better part of a decade before Brittany ever signed a marriage certificate. None of it was reachable. Under the state's marital property statutes, with this documentation, there was nothing for a family law attorney to argue about. You could not divide what was never jointly owned. You could not claim what never entered the marital estate. Denise set the partnership agreement down. Her pen was still in her hand, but she had stopped pretending she was taking notes. She looked at Harold across the table. Harold looked back at her without expression. He was not enjoying this. He was simply working. He placed the third document on the table. Denise recognized the format immediately. Wire transfer records, 3 of them, each clearly dated, clearly sourced. She read the account name on the originating line, Brittany Ann Washington. She read the destination account. She read the recorded transaction descriptions on the receiving end, consulting fees, each one from a company name she did not recognize. She pulled up her phone, searched the company name in 30 seconds, and found what Harold already knew she would find. A registered LLC with no website, no address beyond a P.O. box in Delaware, and no discernible business activity of any kind. She set her phone face down on the table. She looked at the 3 wire transfers for another moment. Then she closed her portfolio. She thanked Harold for his time. She said it without inflection, the way a professional does when the meeting has told them everything they needed to know, and there is nothing left to negotiate. Harold stood, shook her hand again, and packed his briefcase with the same unhurried efficiency with which he had opened it. Denise Fuller took the elevator to the parking garage alone. She sat in her car for a moment before she dialed. Then she called Brittany and told her, in the measured language of a woman who had delivered bad news many times and had learned to deliver it cleanly, that the landscape of her situation had changed significantly, and that Denise was not the right attorney for what Brittany now needed. The call lasted 4 minutes. The moment it ended, Brittany called Garrison. Voicemail. She called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. A 4th time. and the line rang once and went silent in the particular way of a call that had been sent away deliberately by a hand that knew exactly whose name was on the screen. The report was 41 pages. Jerome had sent it over at 6:47 in the morning with a single line of text beneath it. "Read it all the way through before you call me." Andre had printed it. He did that with documents that mattered. Paper was slower than a screen, and slow was how he read things he needed to understand completely. He sat at his desk at the firm with the pages in front of him and a coffee going cold at his elbow, and he read. Garrison Price had been running the same scheme for 4 years. It was not complicated, as these things go. That was the first thing that struck Andre, how simple it was at its core, how much of its success depended not on sophistication, but on the assumption that nobody was paying close enough attention. Garrison acquired properties through over-leveraged deals, borrowing against each new acquisition to service the debt on the last one, keeping himself liquid by keeping himself moving. On paper, the portfolio looked like growth. In practice, it was a man running hard enough in place that the ground beneath him never had time to give way. The income concealment was where it got deliberate. A network of shell companies, 7 of them, spread across 4 states, each registered to a variation of the same P.O. box addresses, received payments recorded as consulting fees, management contracts, service retainers. None of the companies had employees. None had offices. None had any business activity that a forensic accountant would find credible for longer than about 40 minutes, which was apparently how long Jerome's retained accountant had needed before he started flagging entries. The cash moved through the shells and emerged on the other side as personal income that Garrison reported at a fraction of its actual value. 4 years. Dozens of transactions. A tax liability that the forensic accountant estimated, conservatively, in the low 7 figures. Andre turned to the section on Brittany. The 3 wire transfers sat in the middle of the report the way a stone sits in still water, the thing around which everything else organized. Garrison had needed to move a specific pool of money in a specific window of time, without the transactions appearing in any account connected to his name or his network of shells. He had needed distance, clean distance, an account with no prior connection to him, held by someone whose name would not trigger a flag in any existing investigation, someone whose apparent separation from a stable domestic life provided a plausible surface reason for new financial activity. Brittany had provided all of it. The report did not editorialize. Jerome never did. It simply laid out the sequence, the timing of when Garrison had introduced the arrangement to Brittany, the specific accounts involved, the recorded descriptions on the receiving end, the gap between what Brittany was told she was doing and what she was actually doing. She had believed she was helping manage legitimate business expenses. She had believed she was building something. She had moved the money because a man she trusted had asked her to, and she had not asked enough questions, and Garrison had known she would not. He had selected her for that reason. Andre read that section twice. The second time, he read it the same way he had read the first, without flinching, without looking away, just taking it in fully and filing it in the correct place. The text messages were in the appendix. Harold had coordinated the legal channel through which Jerome obtained them, a process that had taken the better part of 2 weeks, and that Andre had not asked about in detail, because Harold did not need to be managed and Jerome did not need to be supervised. The messages were between Garrison and a business associate named Calvin Reese, recovered from a shared project management platform both men had used for a dissolved partnership. They were dated 3 months before Brittany threw the garbage bag at Andre on the front porch. In them, Garrison referred to Brittany not by name. He called her the situation. He told Reese that the situation had served its purpose, and that he was planning to begin stepping back from it over the following 6 to 8 weeks, gradually, cleanly, in a way that would not produce complications. He used the word Extract. He discussed the timeline with the tone of a man scheduling a contractor's final visit, not a man ending a relationship. 6 to 8 weeks. He had given himself a schedule. Brittany had moved first. She had thrown her marriage away for a man who was already building his exit, who had already looked at his calendar and decided when he was done with her, who had referred to her, in writing, to another man, as the situation. Andre sat with that for a long moment. The office was quiet. Outside the window, the city moved the way it always did, indifferent, continuous, completely unbothered. He looked at the skyline for a moment, then looked back at the report. He picked up his phone and called Harold. "Send everything to Okafor. Jerome's full report. The accountant's analysis, all of it." A pause. "The texts, too. The ones about Brittany." Harold asked why specifically those. Andre's voice was even. "Because she deserves to read them. Not from me. From a federal officer, across a table. That's where it'll land the way it should." By 3 that afternoon, Okafor had the complete forensic map in hand. She moved the same day. The order to freeze Garrison Price's primary operating account reached his bank at 3:41 p.m. The bank's compliance department, already skittish about the preliminary inquiries that had been circling Garrison's accounts for the better part of a year, cooperated without pushback. The freeze was in place before 4 o'clock. At 4:22 p.m., the seller's attorney on a commercial property acquisition Garrison had been closing for 4 months. The biggest deal in his pipeline, the one he had been citing to himself as proof that everything was still fine, received a routine title search update that flagged the account freeze. He called his client. His client authorized him to pull out of escrow. He pulled out. 4 months of work. Gone in an email. At 5:15 p.m., Garrison's phone rang. It was his own attorney. The voice on the other end was not alarmed. It was something worse than alarmed. It was quiet and professional, and completely without surprise. The voice of a man who had been watching this particular horizon for some time, and had simply been waiting for the weather to arrive. He told Garrison it was time to come in. Brittany told herself it was the right move. That was how she framed it on the 40-minute drive to Dorothy's neighborhood. Not as desperation, not as reaching for the last lever available to her, but as a smart move, a strategic one. Dorothy loved her son. Dorothy was reasonable. Dorothy was the kind of woman who believed in grace and second chances and keeping families together. And if anyone could soften Andre's posture on the settlement terms, it was the woman who had raised him. She had rehearsed the whole drive over. Dorothy's house sat at the end of a quiet street, lined with oak trees, old enough to arch over the road and touch in the middle. The yard was small and immaculate. A clay pot of marigolds sat on the front step, deep orange against the red brick. The house smelled, even from the front porch, like something warm. Dorothy answered the door before Brittany could knock a second time. She was wearing a house dress and reading glasses pushed up on her forehead, and she looked exactly the same as she always had. Unhurried, clear-eyed, the kind of woman who had long since stopped being surprised by the world, but had not, in any way, stopped paying attention to it. She opened the door wide and said, "Come on in, baby," the same way she would have said it 2 years ago, before any of this, and Brittany felt something in her chest loosen fractionally with relief. The kitchen was at the back of the house. A round table with 4 chairs, a window that looked out onto a small backyard, with a bird feeder that was doing real business. Dorothy moved to the counter without asking and started coffee. Brittany sat down, folded her hands on the table, and arranged her face into something soft and sorry. "Ms. Dorothy," she started, "I want to thank you for agreeing to see me. I know you didn't have to." Dorothy did not respond to this. She set 2 cups on the counter and waited for the coffee. Brittany took the silence as an opening and filled it, carefully, deliberately, the way she had rehearsed. She talked about the marriage feeling distant, about Andre working long hours and not talking to her the way he used to. about feeling unseen inside her own home, like a woman moving through rooms that belonged to someone else's life. She talked about making mistakes she could not undo, about grief, about how much she had lost. Her voice stayed even and a little rough at the edges, calibrated to sound like it was costing her something. She did not mention Garrison. She did not mention the mug, or the shove, or the bag she had packed 3 days in advance. She did not mention any of that. Dorothy brought the coffee over. She set a cup in front of Brittany, settled into the chair across the table, and wrapped both hands around her own cup. She looked at Brittany, and she listened, all the way to the end. Every word, every careful pause, Dorothy listened without interrupting once. When Brittany finished, the kitchen was quiet except for the birds outside. Dorothy looked at her coffee cup for a long moment. Then she said, "Can I tell you something?" Brittany said yes. Dorothy set her cup down. "Andre's father, Franklin, died when Andre was 11 years old," she said. "We had $480 in a savings account. The tires on the car were so bald you could see the threading. The mortgage was 2 months behind." She said it without drama. The way you state facts you have lived with long enough that they no longer require emphasis to carry weight. I worked 2 cleaning jobs after that. Night shifts, both of them. I cleaned office buildings on the east side of Akron for 11 years. 11 years, she paused. Andre used to do his homework in the break room of a hospital on Maple Street because I had nowhere else to bring him. He'd sit under those fluorescent lights at a folding table with his textbooks, and he never once, not one time, complained about it. Never asked for something I couldn't give him. Brittany was very still. The day he made his first real money, Dorothy said, he called me. And the only thing he said, the first thing, before anything else, was, "Mama, you're done. That's all. Just that." Because he knew what done meant to me. She was quiet for a moment. "That's who you were married to." She looked up then, directly at Brittany. Her eyes were clear and completely without malice. "If you had simply loved him honest," Dorothy said, "he would have given you everything. That's the kind of man he is. But you decided what he was worth before you ever knew him, and you never looked again after that." The kitchen was very quiet. Dorothy stood. She picked up her cup and carried it to the sink. Then she turned and said warmly, as if the visit had been a pleasant one, "Let me walk you out, sweetheart." Brittany sat in her car in Dorothy's driveway and did not move for a long time. She was not calculating. She was not forming a next step or revising a strategy or deciding what to say to Walter Pruitt on Monday morning. There was none of that. There was only the silence, and the marigolds on the front step visible through the windshield, and something moving through her that had no strategic use at all. Something that pressed behind her sternum and would not organize itself into anything manageable. She thought about a man doing homework under fluorescent lights and never complaining. She thought about, you decided what he was worth. She sat there until she couldn't anymore. Then she started the car and drove away. 3 miles across the city, Andre's phone lit up with Harold's name. He answered on the second ring and said, "Tell me where we are." It was time for the final phase. Harold sent the meeting request on a Wednesday morning. The terms were specific. A neutral conference room in a downtown building. Not Andre's office, not anywhere that carried the weight of either of their names. Both attorneys present. No phone calls in the room, no intermediaries waiting in the hall. One meeting, one time, no rescheduling. Walter Pruitt called Brittany that afternoon. He had a careful voice, the voice of a man who delivered bad news regularly enough that he had learned to strip the drama out of it and leave only the substance. He told her she should go. He told her to listen more than she spoke. He told her that cooperation, at this stage of the proceedings, was the only currency she had left that was worth anything. She said she would go. The building was on the corner of 5th and Madison, 14 floors of glass and steel that caught the morning sun and threw it back at the street. The conference room was on the top floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a long rectangular table in dark wood, 8 chairs that no one was using except the 4 that mattered, a credenza along the wall with a water pitcher, and glasses no one touched. Brittany arrived first. She sat on one side of the table with Walter Pruitt to her left. She had dressed carefully, not contritely, the way she dressed for Dorothy's kitchen, but carefully, with the particular precision of someone who understood they were being looked at and had decided to give nothing away through appearance. Her hands were folded on the table. Still. Andre came in 2 minutes later with Harold. He did not look at her when he entered. He set his jacket over the back of his chair, sat down, and placed a single manila folder on the table in front of him. He did not open it. He folded his hands on top of it, looked across the table, and met her eyes with an expression that was completely without anger, and somehow, because of that, much harder to sit across from than anger would have been. Harold sat at one end of the table, Walter Pruitt at the other. Neither of them spoke. Andre spoke. He spoke for 14 minutes. He did not rush. He did not raise his voice, not once, through any of it. He used no dramatic pauses, no loaded silences designed to make her flinch. He simply moved through what he knew in precise order, the way a man reads a document he has read many times before, and no longer needs to perform. He simply needs to convey it. He started with the note, the cabinet above the sink, the address, the date, the time, the single name. He told her exactly when he found it, what he did with it, and what it set in motion. He told her about the rental car and the parking lot and the 4 calls he made while he waited. He told her what Agent Webb said and what that name, Okafor, meant in the context of an investigation that had been running for 18 months before Brittany ever packed that garbage bag. He told her about Jerome's forensic report. He laid it out without editorializing. The shell companies, the consulting fees that went nowhere, the 3 wire transfers that had her name on them, and Garrison's fingerprints all over the purpose. He watched her face as he explained what those transfers meant inside a federal fraud case. He did not look away. He gave her every word of it. Then he told her about the text messages. He told her that Garrison's communications, recovered through a legal channel Harold had coordinated, referred to her not by name. He said the word plainly, without cushioning it, the situation. He told her the messages included a timeline, a specific, deliberate plan for when and how Garrison intended to extract himself from their arrangement. He told her the date those messages were sent, 3 months before she threw a garbage bag at her husband on a front porch at 2 in the morning. The room was completely silent. Brittany's face had not moved through most of it. She had the locked stillness of someone absorbing impacts too fast to process each one individually. But something shifted when he said the date. Something small and involuntary. There and gone. Andre saw it. He did not react to it. He said, "I want you to understand what the next 2 years look like. The federal matter does not resolve quickly. You are a material witness in a case with 3 counts of wire fraud and 2 of tax fraud. Your finances will be reviewed. The recovered funds come out of your accounts. Legal fees come before anything else." He said it the way a doctor describes a prognosis, clearly without cruelty, because clarity is not the same thing as cruelty. He slid Harold's settlement documentation across the table to Walter Pruitt, without opening the folder. Walter Pruitt looked at it. He did not speak. Andre said, "I am not here because I need you to feel what you did. I am here, so there is no version of this you can tell yourself later, where you didn't know." He held her eyes. "You knew. You chose. Carry that, with full information." The room held the silence. Andre stood. He buttoned his jacket. He extended his hand to Walter Pruitt and said, "Thank you for your time, Walter," using his first name the way people do when they mean it. He nodded to Harold. He moved toward the door. At the frame, he stopped. He did not turn around. His voice was quiet, unhurried, like a man who had already gone somewhere else and was leaving one last thing behind. "I hope somewhere in all of this," he said, "there is something that was worth the cost." He walked out. The door closed behind him. The morning light came in flat and steady through the floor-to-ceiling windows, moving across the table in a long, pale line. Brittany sat on her side of it and looked at the closed door and did not move. Walter Pruitt set the settlement documents down in front of him. He uncapped his pen. He did not speak. He did not check his watch. He simply waited, in the patient way of a man who understood that some moments require their full amount of time, and this was one of them. The federal charges landed on a Tuesday morning, 11 weeks after the night of the SUVs. Wire fraud, tax fraud, conspiracy to commit financial crimes. 3 counts, each with sentencing exposure significant enough that Garrison's attorney stopped using the word manageable after the first reading and switched to complex. Okafor's case was not complex. It was thorough in the particular way that cases become thorough when a man has been genuinely reckless for a genuinely long time, and the people surrounding him valued proximity to his image more than they valued knowing what was underneath it. The forensic documentation Jerome's accountant produced had given Okafor the connective tissue she needed. The shell companies mapped cleanly to the transaction records. The consulting fees pointed to companies with no operational footprint. The wire transfers with Brittany's name on them sat in the middle of it all like a signature. Okafor's office was not particularly interested in negotiating. Garrison's professional network dissolved in the way that things dissolve when they were never structural to begin with, fast and without ceremony. Business associates stopped returning calls within the first week. Not all at once, one by one, in the quiet way of people who are recalculating exposure and finding that the math no longer works in his favor. A regional commercial real estate association removed him from an advisory committee. No announcement, no explanation, just his name gone from the website one morning like it had never been there. A regional magazine that had been developing a profile on him, the new face of Southern real estate development, the working title had been, killed the piece without a statement. The editor sent a single email to Garrison's publicist. The publicist did not reply because the publicist had already stopped picking up. The properties came apart more slowly, but more completely. Without liquid capital, and with his primary operating account frozen, Garrison could not service the debt on 3 acquisitions simultaneously. 2 went into default within 6 weeks of the account freeze. Over-leveraged deals that had only ever stayed afloat because Garrison kept moving money fast enough that no one could see what was underneath. The lenders moved the moment they had legal standing to do so. A commercial property acquisition he had been closing for 4 months, his biggest deal in 2 years, the one he had been using as proof to himself that everything was fine, was already gone, killed the day the account freeze hit escrow. By the time the legal proceedings were well underway, Garrison Price's real estate portfolio existed mostly on paper. Paper that was in the hands of creditors who were not interested in his explanations. He moved into his brother's spare bedroom in a suburb 40 minutes from the city. The room had a twin bed and a window that faced a fence. He drove a car 4 years older than anything he would have been seen in 18 months ago. A dark blue sedan with a small dent above the rear wheel, well, that he told himself he would have fixed, and never did. He kept his phone charged and close at all times, waiting for calls from his attorney about trial dates that kept shifting on the calendar. The charm was still there, technically. The cadence of it, the timing, the way his face arranged itself when he needed something from someone. But charm is downstream of confidence, and confidence is downstream of the belief that you are operating from a position of strength. Without the portfolio, without the lifestyle, without the performance of success that had always been the load-bearing wall of everything Garrison Price presented to the world, the charm had nothing to stand on. People could feel it now. The mechanism of it, the way it reached for something that was no longer there. Brittany's divorce finalized 38 days after the conference room meeting. Harold's terms held completely. She did not get the house. She had no claim to Washington Capital Group. None of it. Not the equity. Not the contracts. Not a single number from a firm she had spent 3 years living beside, without ever asking what it actually did. She walked away with her personal accounts, her car, and a civil liability judgment requiring her full cooperation with the federal recovery of the transferred funds. The money came back entirely within 6 months, pulled from accounts she had believed were hers to keep. Walter Pruitt had negotiated her down to material witness status, carefully, over several weeks, in the quiet and persistent way of a good criminal defense attorney who understood what his client had to offer and exactly how much it was worth. She was not charged. But she could not leave the state without notifying a federal liaison for the duration of the proceeding. She checked in monthly. The process stretched past a year. She moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a suburb she would not have driven through 2 years ago without a specific reason. The apartment was clean and adequate, with beige carpet and a kitchen window that looked out onto the parking lot. She took a job in pharmaceutical sales, the career she had left when she married Andre, the one she had told herself she was finished with, the one that was waiting for her now with the patience of something that had never needed her to come back, but was willing to take her anyway. Her colleagues did not know her history. She did not discuss her ex-husband. She did not discuss Garrison. She was, in the fabric of her daily life, simply a woman in her mid-30s trying to keep her head down and let a situation she had built entirely by herself finish running its course. 4 months after the federal charges were filed, her phone rang. She looked at the screen. She knew the number even though it had been months since it appeared there. She sat with it ringing in her hand for a moment, thinking about nothing in particular. Or maybe thinking about everything at once, which sometimes feels the same way. She answered. She understood within 30 seconds what he wanted. She could hear it in the specific way he was being careful, the way he was layering the question inside something that was trying to sound like concern. He needed her to corroborate something that would help his defense, something small, he was implying. The word small, carrying all the weight of a man who had spent his whole life making large things sound like nothing. She hung up. She did not say anything before she did. She simply ended the call and set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood there in the quiet of her apartment. After a while, she moved to the window and looked out at the parking lot. The evening was ordinary. Cars pulling in, a woman walking a dog along the far curb, the last light going gray behind the tree line at the edge of the lot. She thought about a note taped inside a cabinet door. A small note, handwritten, tucked where no one would think to look for it, or where almost no one would. She thought about what it meant that he had found it, and said nothing, and gone to bed and slept, and built everything that followed out of that single quiet moment of knowing. She thought about what that felt like from the inside, that kind of patience, that kind of intelligence, moving underneath the surface of an ordinary evening while she poured herself a glass of wine and looked at her phone and felt, for just a moment, like she was winning. She stood at her window for a long time. The marsh talked all morning. That was the thing about coastal Georgia that Andre had never been able to explain to anyone who hadn't sat beside it. The way the water and the grass and the birds all ran together into one continuous sound, layered and alive, like the land itself was breathing. He had owned this house for 7 years. He still wasn't used to it. He wasn't sure he wanted to be. He sat in the rocking chair with his coffee and his book and let the sound settle around him. The house was not a large house. It was not built to impress anyone. Wide plank floors that had been worn smooth by years of use. Deep windows that pulled in the morning light and held it. A porch that wrapped all the way around and was clearly the point of everything. The room the architect had been building toward without saying so. Andrei had bought it quietly, through the same holding structure he used for everything, and had told almost no one it existed. Dorothy knew. Jerome knew. That had always been enough. For a long time, it had been the place he came to be sure of himself, to feel the specific weight of what he had built, away from the performance of not having built it. He didn't need it to serve that purpose anymore. Now, it was just home. The numbers, when he let himself think about them plainly, were still something he had to approach slowly. Not from shame, not from the old instinct to conceal, but from a kind of quiet respect for what they represented. Harold had guided the equity restructuring through without drama, the way Harold did everything. And when it settled, Andrei's personal net worth had crossed $50 million for the first time. He had sat with that number in Harold's office for a moment before signing anything, not performing humility, not suppressing satisfaction, just sitting with it honestly, the way his father would have wanted him to. The Green Infrastructure Partnership was Jerome's find, a sector Andrei had been watching for 3 years, waiting for the right structure and the right moment. It was already outperforming projections by 14%. Jerome had sent him the latest numbers on Thursday with a single line of commentary. Told you. Dorothy called every Sunday at 8:30. It did not matter what time zone Andrei was in. It did not matter if he had texted her the night before. At 8:30 on Sunday morning, her name appeared on his screen, and he answered, and she told him about her week, the church potluck, her neighbor's new dog, the roses along her front walk that were coming in better than last year. She lived 2 miles from her church now, in a house she had chosen herself from 4 options Andrei identified. A house with a front porch and a yard, and a kitchen window she had specifically requested face east for the morning light. She had never asked for the number. She had never needed it. He drove a different car now. Nothing that announced him. Andrei Washington was not going to become that man. Not at 38. Not at any age. But he had made a quiet decision in the months after the divorce to stop using understatement as armor. He was not hiding anymore. He was simply himself, at full size, moving through a world that had not broken him. He had been seeing Claudette Rivers for 6 months. She was a structural engineer, adaptive bridge design, which was more interesting than it sounded once she explained it. And she had explained it on their first real evening together because Andrei had asked and actually wanted to know. She worked out of Atlanta, presented at industry conferences, and moved through the world with the easy confidence of someone who had built their standing through genuine competence and never had to borrow from anyone else's impression of them. On that first evening, she had asked him what he valued, not what he did, not what he had built, not where he saw himself in 5 years, what he valued. And then she had listened to his answer without nodding at the right moments to show she was listening, without tilting her head at the parts that were supposed to be touching. She had simply listened, the way you listen when you are actually interested in the answer rather than in how your listening looks. He had recognized the feeling immediately. Recognized it the way you recognize something you haven't experienced in so long that you'd almost stopped believing it was real. He had not told her the full number yet. He would. There was no fear in waiting this time. No concealment, no armor, no strategic withholding. It was simply the natural order of a thing building toward what it was going to be, and he was content to let it build at the pace it wanted. Jerome arrived Friday evening with Maya and the kids. The children took over the back porch inside of 10 minutes with the fishing kit Jerome had picked up at a bait shop down the road. Andrei and Jerome sat out front with beers and watched the marsh go gold in the last of the afternoon light, talking in the easy shorthand of men who had shared so much for so long that silence was as comfortable as anything they could have said. Saturday morning they fished off the dock. They didn't talk much. The birds were loud, and the water was still, and the light came in flat and clean off the marsh, and neither of them needed to fill any of it. That evening, Jerome leaned back in his chair and said, almost like he was talking to himself, "You never told me about this place." Andre was quiet for a moment. The marsh moved. "I always had it," he said. "I just didn't know yet who was safe to bring here." Jerome nodded once. He understood exactly what that meant. Not just the house, not just the marsh, but the years of a man moving carefully through a world that had required carefulness, building something real in the quiet, while everything else played out the way it needed to play out. They sat there until the light was gone. Somewhere in a suburb neither of them would ever visit, Brittany Washington sat by her apartment window with a glass of wine. The federal matter had resolved. The monthly check-ins were done. She was free to move, to travel, to apply for the job in Charlotte she had been watching on her phone for 3 weeks, to begin again in whatever shape was still available to her. She had more options than she had earned, which was a mercy she hadn't arranged. She thought about Andre sometimes, not with longing. It wasn't longing. It wasn't anything that clean. It was something that had no name she'd found yet. Something that lived in the space between understanding and grief, between accountability and the helpless wish that understanding had arrived sooner. She thought about the garbage bag hitting his chest and the way he caught it without stumbling. She thought about the jacket Jerome handed him at the end of the driveway. She thought about the way he got into that SUV without turning around, not in anger, not in performance, simply because he had already decided that she was behind him and he was facing forward, and there was nothing left in her direction worth the turn. She thought about Dorothy's kitchen table, about the coffee cup between Dorothy's hands, and the words that had followed her out of that house and into every quiet room she'd sat in since. He would have given you everything if you had simply loved him honest. She had turned those words over so many times that they had worn smooth. She understood them now in the full, flat, irreversible way that you understand something when it is too late for the understanding to be useful. She didn't know about the marsh. She didn't know about the house, the porch, the wide plank floors, and the light coming in off the water in the morning. She didn't know about Claudette. She never would. What she had lost was not a number. It was never a number. It was a man in a rocking chair by the water, patient and quiet, and extraordinary in the complete and unhurried way of someone who had never once needed her, or anyone, to know it. She had decided what he was worth before she ever knew him, and he had already moved on before she finished paying for it. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.